Hey everybody, welcome to Life is Brewtiful. I'm Anthony, and today we are going to be doing another episode of A Story in Every Bottle. It's the segment of my channel where we find one particular beer and we go through and we talk about its entire history. It's usually pretty dang interesting. It's definitely one of my favorite segments to film. And this one was actually a request. So today we're going to be discussing the one, the only Newcastle Brown Ale. The story of Newcastle Brown Ale starts in England following the conclusion of World War I, when all the soldiers were returning back home to their previous employment, and one man in particular, Lieutenant Colonel James Herbert Porter, was insanely successful during the war, gaining a ton of accolades. And that kind of motivated him, inspired him. That way, when he went back home, he really wanted to prove himself, establish himself as a significant powerhouse in the world of brewing. His first project upon returning back to his brewing duties was a beer known as Newcastle's Exhibition Ale, and it was a smash success. But it was also a huge surprise. Exhibition Ale was a traditional cask-served beer, and during this point in time, cask ales were actually on the major decline because people were preferring to choose their beers in take-home packages such as bottles or even growlers at the time. Understanding this, Mr. Porter wanted to try to do something a bit different. He wanted to move over into the bottle packaging market, and in doing so, he didn't want to just create some normal beer that he could put in bottles and sell. He wanted to make the best bottled beer on the market, period. The way he decided to do this was begging the owners of the Newcastle brewery, please invest in top-of-the-line bottling technology, invest in the top-of-the-line equipment that would allow us to make the best beer for that bottle. And all while these new renovations and construction projects were underway for his dream bottled product, he was developing a specialized team, experts in their field, capable of assisting him in producing the best bottled beer, period. Mr. Porter hired a man named Archie Jones, who was one of the best chemists in all of the UK, and together, over the next 3 years, continuously brewed, improved, experimented, and developed his dream beer. Mr. Porter's idea of the perfect beer needed to be a little bit lighter to survive the early processes of bottling, which was a bit rougher on the beers than cask aling would be. Additionally, he still wanted to maintain that traditional classic British brewing heritage. He wanted it to be malty, he still wanted it to be a bit full, and he still wanted it to be insanely flavorful. So what he ended up doing was cutting a bunch of dextrin malts into the beer to be able to give it a little bit of a fuller, rounder feel, also giving it a good amount of sweetness. He then used traditional European UK hops to give it that nice hoppy bite that was all the rage at the time. And lastly, he decided to use a little bit of corn sugar. That way you would still have the lighter, easier packaging beer, but it would kind of have that illusionary effect of being fuller due to all the dextrin malts. And all of these processes together created a surprisingly complex and insanely enjoyable drinking beer, especially for that time period. They created the Newcastle Brown Ale. Now, we know today that Newcastle Brown Ale is certainly one of the most widely recognized and arguably one of the most successful beers to have ever been brewed ever anywhere. But at the time, during its initial test batches, Mr. Porter saw this beer as an absolute failure. And that's because what he had actually wanted to do was create essentially a clone of the famous Bass Pale Ale. But obviously he failed in that attempt because this is nothing like that. And because of that, he saw it as a failure. In addition to Mr. Porter's reservations, the Newcastle execs were also pretty wary of this beer. And that's because the English brown ale style, at one point in time, had been one of the most successful and widespread, most drank, most brewed beer styles in all of the UK. But that was a glory day for the beer style, long since passed at this point. So the Newcastle execs weren't quite confident that they were going to be able to market it and sell it. So what they decided they were going to do was they're going to take a look back at what exactly made the brown ale so successful in its initial conception. And what they discovered was that it was insanely popular amongst blue-collar workers, specifically coal miners. Now, the reason the brown ale kind of initially faded away was around 1902, the coal industry had taken a sharp decline. There wasn't as many coal workers, and with the dying out of that industry, so too died the popularity of the brown ale beer style. However, with the massive war effort created a massive need for raw materials, and the coal industry saw a massive boom. But there was no brown ale for them. And that's where Newcastle saw their new burgeoning market. It's the exact same as it was, just with a new face, a new brand. They were going to revitalize the brown ale beer style, utilizing what made it successful in the first place. The Newcastle execs were coming around to the idea, but luckily for Mr. Porter, one new development would basically push them over the edge to go full committal on this beer. There were rumors that a nearby brewery were planning to bottle and distribute their own brown ale. So, wanting to beat them to the punch and be the first bottled brown ale on the UK people's brains, Newcastle knew they had to go to market immediately. So, Newcastle was born, approved, and started to be brewed. Newcastle was originally released to the thirsty awaiting public in 1927, and it was an instantaneous smash success. Not only did it kind of get in with that original blue collar industry that they were trying to hope to get into, but people viewed it as a scientifically superior beer than its competitors because the story about its careful design and its specific brewing purpose and process really resonated with people who were craving a higher quality beer. There's even stories about the local police begging Newcastle to alter its original recipe because people were drinking it so much, so quickly, so often that it was just causing widespread drunken belligerence. But what I think the best accolade for this beer is that its customers viewed it as being the most consistently high quality product available to them. Anytime somebody went and got a Newcastle Brown Ale, they knew what they were going to get, and they got high quality, high flavor, delicious beer with a little bit of an alcoholic punch. And it's because of this that it was voted as being the best beer in London in 1928. However, this success was very short-lived. Around the 1930s, they decided that they were going to alter their recipe in order to be a little bit more cost-effective, and because of that, they lost massive swaths of their drinking community that had been so vigorously excited about it during its initial release. Newcastle kind of expected this, but they felt that they had no option. They had to cut production costs in order to compete with, at the time, a burgeoning yet oversaturated market. Additionally, this was leading up to the initial throes of World War II, and rations and ingredients were becoming a lot stricter and harder to find, so they knew that they had to brew the beer at a decrease in both quality ingredients and amount of ingredients, creating a beer that was viewed as drastically inferior to its former initial release. I mean, it was so significant that during this initial cut, the beer fell from over 7% down to 5.5%. That is a huge change for a beer. It might not seem like a whole lot, like 1.5 points, but it's a lot. And because of all these changes, sales plummeted. And over the next couple of decades, Newcastle Brown Ale just kind of went behind the scenes. It was certainly still a great seller, and it was certainly the best seller out of Newcastle, but it didn't have that sense, that initial surge of being the best beer until the 1960s, where it did see a little bit of a resurgence. In the 1960s, Newcastle Brewery was purchased by the Scottish Brewers Conglomerate, and the Scottish Brewers Conglomerate decided that they wanted to take this beer and put it back into the forefront of the beer drinker's mind. They wanted it to see its glory days once again. So again, Newcastle was focused on its marketing and its distribution into blue collar and coal mining industries and regions that focus specifically on the blue collar. They didn't want that whole scientifically superior vibe about it anymore, because that had kind of been washed away and a little bit tarnished during that initial recipe change downfall. But they knew that they would be able to market it as a hearty beer that you could be purchased for moderately cheap and easily available for the hard-working citizens of the UK. And it was so successful that Newcastle and Newcastle Brown Ale saw unprecedented unprecedented growth during this time period. Focusing on its success, they knew that they needed to be able to get it out and get it out as fast as possible in the best quality that they could. So they started packaging it in cans and, for the first time, brown bottles to improve its quality. Interestingly, they did see a little bit of a pushback from their core demographic because they actually preferred the skunked clear bottled version as opposed to the brown bottle that wasn't light stricken. And once again, it saw a massive decline in sales due to a change. And this trend of growth and rise and fall happened over and over again over the next couple of decades. And I can't say it was always because of this, but it does seem to correlate that oftentimes that fall would come after some type of change, whether it would be a label change or a recipe change or a packaging change. Despite all of this, in the 90s, Newcastle Brown Ale was still one of the best selling products coming out of England. Things really started to change for Newcastle in 2009 when they were actually purchased by Heineken, based in the Netherlands. And many people see this as being the worst thing to ever happen to Newcastle in its long history. Almost immediately after its acquisition, the Newcastle brewery in the UK was shut down in order to move all of the brown ale's production over to the Heineken facility. That pissed off a lot of locals because a lot of locals were employed there and a lot of locals consumed there. They had pride in it, you know? And when that was taken away from them, it caused a lot of backlash. But the bigger impact all around the globe was when they decided that they were going to cut over 5% of its crystal malt content in order to be replaced by caramel flavoring and coloring. The backlash against this caramel additive was so massive that both the United States and the UK launched investigations into Heineken to identify whether or not this substance was harmful or safe or possibly causing cancer. Eventually, both nations concluded that it was safe in small amounts, so be careful how much Newcastle you drink. The backlash was so severe that they actually had to remove the caramel coloring in 2015. But the damage was already done. In 2015, the global sales of Newcastle Brown Ale fell by the millions of barrels. Sales were especially low in the United States, where most of the health concerns were coming from. But Heineken did have an ace up its sleeve. They decided that they were going to purchase Lagunitas. Heineken decided that Lagunitas should be the ones to kind of revamp Newcastle Brown Ale for the American public. Lagunitas decided that they were going to add a little bit of an American flair with some American hops like Chinook and Centennial. Additionally, they were going to kind of bolster its malty profile to focus on the sweet and roasty characters that you would look for in a brown ale. It also needed a bit of a facelift, so they gave it a brand new label to help it be a little bit more competitive and help it stand out from some of the other imports while also distancing itself from its UK brother, which had received such a bad name. It was a different label, a different recipe, but the same name. And I was extremely curious about this, and it was rather successful in its initial relaunch. You know, there was a lot of interest, a lot of buzz going around it, because not often do you get to see the rebirth of such a classic and historic beer. Although I will say, I don't think it's quite as popular nowadays. I tried to speak with a couple different beer reviewers back in the States to see if they would be able to get a UK version and an American version and have them side by side. And in a lot of markets, you could only find one or the other. You weren't able to find both. And I was talking to people in the Northwest, I was talking to people down in the Southeast. It's just seems to be pick and choose which beer gets sent to which state and which location and which region. So I had to steal this side-by-side comparison from YouTube. So thank you very much, and all credit for the original producer of that video in the description and on the screen.
But they're both Newcastle Brown Ales, but they're different, but they're the same. How is that? Well, one of them has been brewed at Heineken in the Netherlands. This one right here, it says Holland. And the other one has been brewed in the US of A. Yay, where? At Lagunitas Brewing Company. Now, they both clock in at 4.7% ABV. Now, this is where they start to differ a little bit. The USA version is 28 IBUs, and the Holland version, or Netherlands version, is 17 IBUs. So let's get into it. We'll start first about the appearance, talking that is, of the original Newcastle Brown Ale. It is caramel colored. That's it. Aroma! Caramel malt, tons of caramel sweetness, bready notes, some earthy hop, mild roast. That's it. Cheers! Thin and watery. You heard me say, you know, some aromas and everything in there, but I didn't say skunk. The reason that is, this came from a closed 12-pack carrier where no light got to this bottle. I picked it that way on purpose to make it fair with the brown bottle. Burnt brown sugar and some earthy hops. That's it. An okay beer. Not a mind blower. It's Newcastle Brown. It's what you expect it to taste like. Now, let's talk about the appearance of the Lagunitas brewed version. It's a little bit darker. It's more of a burnt sort of garnet color. Sounds like this one, by the ingredients, is all malt. More proteins in it. The head's gonna last longer. So let's dive in for that. Aroma! Definitely got some hop on there, some piney notes, a little bit of citrus, some herbaceous notes, some roasty toasty notes, but definitely a bigger, more Americanized sort of hop presence. It smells like an old school kind of homebrewed version of a brown ale in a lot of ways. Cheers! Definitely has more hop presence to it. Centennial thing going on. Light piney earthiness in there as well. Tons of like burnt roasty notes. It's got more viscosity, definitely more body than the original Newcastle. Way less sweet. It's good. It's not a mind blower. We're gonna say which one we like better first, then I'll give it a grade. I like the American version better, not because I'm a Lagunitas head and a Lagunitas fan. It's way more, you know, inclined towards the American palate for sure. But if you're a fan of the original Newcastle, you may not like this one because the big driving sweetness that's in this beer, if you're looking for that. But I like this one a little bit better. This is, for my palate these days, a little too sweet. So the next DJ's Brew Tube, I got nothing but, I guess, a bunch of Newcastle Brown Ale drink of love for you, either one version, and you know what's coming for you by now. That's right, a big ass peace out!
Either way, I can say that this has been a roller coaster, and its entire history is just up and down, massive peaks, massive lows. But throughout all of it, it is still successful. It has still succeeded. It has survived. And you have to give it kind of credit for that, you know? It was designed for a specific purpose, and although I would argue that it doesn't live up to its original intention, it still has a unique elegance about it, you know? I don't think there's many other skunky beers that I could really enjoy drinking. And through all of its controversy and through all of its backlash from its consumers and recipe changes and everything, it's still just a good beer, you know? I have absolutely no problem kicking these back at like a barbecue or something like that. It's a casual, non-thinking beer. And because of that, I like it. And I think that's what its true appeal is. So in conclusion, this beer's crazy. Thank you very much for watching, everybody. I really hope you enjoyed. I had a lot of fun researching this, even though it was a little bit of a headache with all the back and forths. It was still a lot of fun. Thank you so much for the suggestion. And for anybody else, if you want me to cover a very specific beer and you want me to go through its entire history, please leave a comment down in the description. I will do my best. Even though this took me way longer than I originally intended it to be, I swear I will get to every single recommendation if it's a good idea, you know. So thank you for watching. Like, comment, subscribe. Remember, there's a story in every bottle, and that life is brewtiful. Cheers.